All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us at this ACSES webinar that's being presented by Dr. Rong Zhu from Flinders University on his project Socioeconomic Disadvantages, Choice of Disciplines, and Post-University Labour Market Outcomes. I'm going to start with an acknowledgement of country. The Australian Centre for Student Equity and Success acknowledges Indigenous peoples as the traditional owners of the land. With 68,000 years of history as the original educators, their knowledge and culture play a vital role in our work and vision for a fairer nation. We respect elders past, present, and future, and are honored to learn from Indigenous colleagues, partners, and friends. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Ian Lee. I'm the Director of the Research and Policy Program at ACSES. Earlier this year, ACSES awarded 10 small research grants on higher education equity to teens at institutions around the country. We are now in a position where we are able to start sharing the early findings of these small grant projects. And over the next few months, we'll be hosting more events to disseminate the findings of these projects. We are delighted to offer the first of these events by Dr. Rong Zhu from Flinders, who will be presenting on his small grant titled Socioeconomic Disadvantages, Choice of Disciplines, and Post-University Labour Market Performance. I'm pleased to introduce Rong, who is a senior lecturer in economics at Flinders University and a research fellow at the Institute of Labour Economics based at the University of Bonn in Germany. Rong is an expert in the areas of education, labour, and health economics, and he has an established record of publications in leading journals such as the Journal of Health Economics and the Journal of Economic Behaviour and Organisation. Rong also has an established track record in competitive research grants from the ARC, ACSES, and also from the NCVER. Rong was a recipient of the 2022 South Australian Young Tall Poppy Science Award. Now, before I hand over to Rong, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. Just to let everyone know, closed captions have been enabled and should appear as an option to turn off or turn on in the Zoom menu bar. We are taking questions at the end of Rong's session, and you can submit your questions through the Q&A chat throughout the webinar, and we will get to this during the Q&A session. If you would like to speak when we go to Q&A, please raise your hand. Okay, and with that, thank you, Rong, for making time for this today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ian, for the introduction. Let me share my screen with you. This one. Can you see my slides? Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present this research with Professor Xiaodong Gong at the University of Canberra. Today, I'm going to present a study about socioeconomic disadvantages, choice of disciplines, and the post-university labor market performance. As this project is still work in progress, any comments and feedbacks are greatly appreciated. First, I would like to make two acknowledgements. We acknowledge the funding from the 2024 Small Grants Research Program of the Australian Centre for Student Equity and Success. And I would also like to acknowledge the unit record data from the household income and the labor dynamics in Australian survey. Without the funding support and the access to the data, this research would not have been possible. We all know that education and training are very important for reduce inequality in Australia and in other parts of the world. And we want to reduce the inequality for the future generations. And education is a good strategy to stop the intergenerational transmission of poverty. The Australian government has made great efforts to equalizing access to higher education. They have encouraged people to attend a higher education, particularly for those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And we have some positive results. According to the Australian Universities Accord Final Report, one of the targets outlined in the 2008 review of Australian higher education to increase the percentage of Australians aged 25 to 34 possessing a bachelor degree to 40% has been achieved. And we have made good progress in encouraging participation in tertiary education. But we have overlooked another form of inequality in higher education, which is related to the choice of academic disciplines when receiving higher education. You can imagine that if people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to choose the academic disciplines that have lower earnings differential, then if the Australians from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are less likely to choose disciplines that with higher earnings potential, then the positive impact of education on inequality will be mitigated by this type of disparity in the choice of academic disciplines. And we have looked at the HILDA data, the household income and the labor dynamics survey in Australia. And we have found that different academic disciplines do have different career prospects for Australians. For example, Australians with a degree in medicine earn an average of $2,400 per week. And those with a degree in engineering and related technologies earn about $2,000 per week. However, those with a degree in food, hospitality, and personal services earn only $1,156 per week. And those with a degree in creative arts earn only $1,000 per week. So we can see that the different choices of academic disciplines are related to the disparities in earnings. If children from disadvantaged backgrounds are more likely to be sorted into fields of study with lower earnings potential, then even when we have the increasing participation in tertiary education, this would at least offset the positive impact of higher education on reducing inequality. In this study, we have 3 research questions. First, we want to describe the pattern of discipline choice among Australian university graduates. And we also would like to look at the pattern of their post-university labor market performance across different disciplines. The second research question is that we want to know whether the choice of field study in tertiary education is affected by different measures of childhood disadvantages. So we will look at the multidimensional disadvantage measures. The last question is that if the field of studies is affected by childhood disadvantages, then how the choice of academic discipline would contribute to the different employment and the earnings trajectory of Australians from different socioeconomic backgrounds. That's the 3 main research questions asked in this study. This study is related to 2 strands of literature. The first one is about the socioeconomic disadvantages and the labor market outcomes. The Edwards and Coates 2011 found a little difference in the short-term employment rates between graduates from different socioeconomic status. But in the long run, graduates from low socioeconomic status are slightly less likely to have a full-time job, but their annual salaries are comparable. In 2014 showed that the indigenous and non-indigenous graduates have similar employment and earnings outcomes. However, among the low-wage earners, indigenous people have a serious disadvantage in the labor market. An additional study by Lee and his co-authors found that relative to non-disadvantaged counterparts, graduates from low socioeconomic status backgrounds experience similar or even slightly better employment and earnings outcomes. However, graduates from non-English speaking backgrounds are less likely to be employed and have lower earnings when compared with their English speaking peers. A recent study by Thomas Whiskey showed that no socioeconomic status graduates experience short-term disadvantages in employment and occupational status, but lots in wages, and university education has helped them to improve their financial situation. And the last study here, Carroll and Lee, found that Australian graduates from low socioeconomic status or with disability or from a non-English speaking background are less likely to be employed in the short term. There is already a literature about the socioeconomic disadvantages and the labor market outcomes, but these studies have focused on the short-term impact of socioeconomic disadvantages and labor market outcomes, and usually their data are not nationally representative. So we contribute to the literature by using the HILDA data, which is nationally representative. And the average age of the respondents in our HILDA data is around 40. So the Australians have graduated from universities for at least 15 years. So we could look at the long-term impact of childhood disadvantages on their labor market performance. This study is also related to the literature on socioeconomic status and the choice of disciplines in university. We have limited evidence from Australia, but there are some evidence from United States and Italy. For example, Goyetti and Mullen 2016 6 found that no socioeconomic status students are more likely to choose vocational majors, but high socioeconomic status students are more likely to choose art and science majors. Additional study by New 2017 found that no socioeconomic status students and non-English speaking background students in the United States have a no propensity of choosing the STEM majors. And the findings of these two studies are somewhat different from each other. And the last study here, Treventine used the data from Italy. They show that the graduates from socioeconomically advantaged backgrounds are more likely to graduate from more rewarding fields of study. So there is a possible relationship between the background and the field of study. The evidence for Australia is very limited. We only have some evidence from high school students. Even more in May 2021, when we studied the high school students in Australia, they found that students from high socioeconomic status are more likely to choose economics. And the Fullerton and Annie 2020 analyzed the year 12 students, and they found that no socioeconomic status are students from no socioeconomic status are less likely to be enrolled in subjects, including mathematics, science, and languages, but more likely to be enrolled in arts, technology, and health and physical education. So we have some dispersed findings regarding the impact of socioeconomic status on the choice of disciplines in university. And we have very limited evidence for Australia. When we use the Hilda data, we are able to look at the actual choice of disciplines. And these two studies are about the preference of year 12 students, but we can analyze the actual choice made by Australians when we use the household income and labor dynamics in Australian survey. The data is here. The data, we know that it's a national representative, it's a longitudinal survey. It started in 2001, and it has been following more than 17,000 Australians in over 7,500 households every year. And the most recent wave is in 2022. It has very rich information about labor market outcomes, life events, and the individual and household well-being. To facilitate the analysis, we have made some sample restrictions. First, we focus on Hilda waves 12, 16, and 20. These data were collected in 2012, 2016, and 2020. We focus on these three waves because the information on fields of study are only available in these waves. Then we also focus on workers having obtained a tertiary degree, because we want to look at the choice of academic discipline. So we should focus on those who have a university degree. And we also focus on those who are aged between 20 and 65. Those who are younger than 20 are less likely to have a university degree. And those who are aged above 65 are more likely to be retired. And we focus on the labor market outcomes or the employment outcomes of those who are aged between 20 and 65. Our final sample includes 9,812 observations for 4,910 workers. The key measures. This slide is about the measure of the childhood socioeconomic disadvantages. We have 5 binary measures. The first one is an indicator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island origin. The second measure indicates whether the person is from a non-English speaking background. It's based on the question about whether English was the first language the respondent learned as a child. The third variable relates to the low childhood socioeconomic status. We follow the literature. Now, individuals with at least one parent working in a managerial or professional occupation are classified as high socioeconomic status, and the rest as no socioeconomic status. We also have looked at the father's unemployment experience. It's based on a question about whether the father experienced unemployment for 6 months or more when the child was growing up. The last measure here is about a single parent family when the child was aged 14, where the father or mother was deceased or did not live with the respondent when he or she was 14 years old. In the data, we also have measures of fields of study, and these measures are only available in waves 12, 16, and 20. We have 15 different fields of study. Because we have so many different fields of study, we need to find a way to categorize them so that we have enough observations in each each field. And what we have done is to categorize the 15 fields into 3 categories based on the information about weekly earnings, weekly gross earnings. There are 15 fields, and we have categorized into 3 groups. The high paying fields of study, there are 5 fields of study in this category, and there are another 5 fields of study in the middle paying fields of study, and the last 5 are in the no fields of study. So we have some cutoff point for their weekly earnings. If the earnings is above $1,800 per week, then the field is considered to be high paying. And if the earnings are between 1,350 and 1,800, then it's considered to be a middle paying field. And if the earnings are lower than 1,350, then it's considered to be a no paying field. So we have 5 disciplines in each of the 3 groups, and this helps us to facilitate the analysis. And we also have considered 4 labor market outcomes: whether the person has a full-time job, and whether the person is employed on a permanent basis, and whether the person is working in a managerial or professional occupation. And the last measure here is weekly gross wages and salary. And we haven't considered the unemployment rate because we are analyzing the university graduates in our data, and the rate of unemployment is very low. That's about 2%. So we only focus on full-time employment, permanent employment, managerial or professional employment, and their wages or salaries. And then here is a table showing some basic summary statistics about our final sample used in the study. 1% of the individuals in our final sample are Aboriginal people, and about 14% are from the non-English speaking backgrounds. 34% of the individuals are from low childhood socioeconomic status, and 11% of the individuals have a father who experienced unemployment for 6 months or more, and about 4% were raised in a single parent family. And the average age here is around 40. And if we, if a typical individual spends 6 years in primary school and 6 years in high school and then 4 years in university, then they should finish their university degree at the age of around 22. And the average age is 40. This means we are able to look at the long-term impact or long-term labor market outcomes. And about 50% are females, and these individuals have an average of 2.2 siblings, and 74% were born in Australia. Most of them are currently married, and their current household size is around 3. And 77% are currently living in a major Australian city. We have 3 research questions. First, we would like to look at the pattern of this discipline choice in university education, and we would also like to look at the labor market performance across the disciplines. So the method to answer the first question is cross-tabulation. Then for our second research question, we would like to look at whether the choice of discipline in university was affected by multidimensional childhood disadvantages. We use the linear probability models. Of course, we can use the probability models or logic models, but here to simplify the analysis, we look at the 2 binary dependent variables. The first one is whether the student studied a high-paying field a lot, and the second dependent variable is whether the student was from a low-paying field of study a lot when they were studying in a tertiary institution. The last question is about how the field of education can explain the different trajectory of earnings and employment for people from different backgrounds. As we have multiple observations for the same person, we use random effects pattern regressions because this is longitudinal data. But because the childhood measures do not change over time, we use the random effects model rather than the fixed effects model. And in our analysis, we control for fields of study, and we run 2 different types of regressions. In the first one, we don't control for fields of study. Then we are able to know the relation between childhood disadvantages and the labor market outcomes that can actually be observed in the labor market. And then we control for the impact of fields of study. Then we know that if the fields of study are the same between those from disadvantages backgrounds and non-disadvantaged backgrounds, then we know what would happen in that hypothetical situation. Now let's have a look at the results for each of the research questions. The first one is about the patterns of field of study. Table 2 shows the field of study in university by birth cohort. And from the table, we know that the three most popular fields of study are management and commerce, education and society and culture. And the three least popular ones are food, hospitality, and personal services, other, and agriculture and environment and related studies. And we also have a look at the choice of academic disciplines by birth cohort. And here I use the birth year of 1980 as the cutoff point. And why we use this as the cutoff point? Because this cutoff point allows us to have about 50% of individuals on each side of the cutoff point. And we could see that the distribution of fields of study are broadly similar, but there are some changes. For example, the younger birth cohorts are more likely to study law. They are more likely to study creative arts. But the younger birth cohorts are less likely to study education. And they are less likely to study society and culture. And we also have look at the distribution of labor market outcomes by field of study. And we look at the 4 measures of labor market outcomes. And we could see that these outcomes vary substantially across the different fields. It tells us that there is indeed a correlation between fields of study and the labor market outcomes. And based on the information about weekly wages, we divided the 15 fields of study into 3 categories: the high paying fields, middle paying fields, and the low paying fields. Table 4 shows the fields of study by childhood disadvantages. And here I use the categorized fields of study. I don't use the detailed fields of study. Because, for example, for the Aboriginal people, they only account for 1% of final sample. If we have 15 fields of study, then we would end up with 2 field observations in 1 cell. So we look at the broader categories. And we could see that Aboriginal people are more likely to choose a low-paying field of study and a middle-paying field of study. And they are less likely to choose a high-paying field of study. That's a difference of around 8 percentage points. If we look at the childhood disadvantages measured by non-English speaking backgrounds, we could tell that those who are from non-English speaking backgrounds are much more likely to choose a high-paying field of study. So that's the difference between 58% and 36%. And those who are from non-English speaking backgrounds are less likely to choose a low-paying field of study and a middle-paying field of study. So it gives us an impression that the choice of academic disciplines indeed differ by the measures of disadvantages. But when we look at no childhood socioeconomic status, the father's unemployment experience, and whether the person was raised in a single parent family, we don't see much difference. If we look at the no childhood socioeconomic status, 24% have studied a no paying field, and 23% have studied a no paying field. That's very similar. We don't see much difference for the last 3 measures of childhood disadvantages. Here is a summary of our main findings for the first research question. In terms of discipline choice, the most popular ones are management and commerce, education, and society and culture. The least popular ones include food, hospitality, and personal services, agriculture, environment, and related studies, and others. And it seems that more recent birth cohorts are more likely to choose creative arts, law, and other health-related disciplines, but less likely to choose education, society, and culture, and nursing. And fields of study are linked to different employment outcomes in terms of the full-time employment, permanent employment, and whether working in a managerial or professional occupation, and their weekly earnings. Non-English speaking background is positively related to high-paying disciplines, but negatively related to low-paying disciplines. But the reverse is true for Aboriginal people. And we don't find a very strong correlations for the other three measures of childhood disadvantages. So whether they were raised in a single parent family and whether they experience father's unemployment for 6 months or more. And the other one is the low childhood socioeconomic status, which was measured by parents' occupation when they were aged 14. That's the first research question. In the second research question, we investigate whether the multidimensional childhood disadvantages have affected their choice of disciplines in universities. The first dependent variable is whether the person has chosen a high-paying university major, and we have 5 measures of childhood disadvantages. The control variables include the dummy variables for the year of birth, their gender, whether the person was born in Australia, the number of siblings they have, and whether the person is living in a major city. And we also have dummies for the states of residence and different waves of health data. And from the table, we can tell that long English speaking background, the dummy variable indicating long English speaking background is the only one that is highly statistically significant. When we look at the ATSI, low childhood socioeconomic status, father's unemployment experience, and the single parent family, all of these variables are not statistically significant. This basically means, Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people have the same preference for academic disciplines, and they are not really different. And the only difference lies in the comparison between non-English speaking background students and those from English speaking background. And here, the coefficient is 0.156. It means that students from non-English speaking backgrounds are 15.6 percentage points more likely to choose a high-paying major in university when compared with their English-speaking background peers. And we have also performed the analysis separately by birth cohort. And we found the same pattern. Those who are from non-English speaking backgrounds are more likely to choose a high-paying field of study. And for the other socioeconomic disadvantage measures, we don't find any statistically significant results. And the next table shows the results for choosing a low-paying university major. So the dependent variable is the dummy variable. It's equal to 1 if the individual choose a low-paying major in university, and it is equal to 0 otherwise. And the table shows us, tells us similar findings. Non-English speaking background students are less likely to choose a low-paying field of study in university. And we have performed analysis for different birth cohorts, and they are not statistically significant, but the coefficients are reasonably large, and they tell us a consistent story. Those who are from non-English speaking backgrounds are more likely to choose a high-paying field, but less likely to choose a low-paying field of study. And we have run different estimations. For example, we have used the ordered problem model to run estimations, because we have the high-paying field of study, low-paying field of study, and a middle-paying field of study. We generated one variable that is equal to 3 if the field of study is the high-paying one. It is equal to 2 if it's middle-paying one, and it is equal to 1 if it's a low-paying one. Then we run the ordered problem model, and we found consistent results, which tells us that students from non-English speaking background are more likely to choose a high-paying field of study, and they are less likely to choose a low-paying field of study in university. And we don't find much evidence for the other 4 measures of childhood disadvantages. Here is the summary of the main results. The non-English speaking background measure is the most significant correlate of the choice of field of study at the university. When we compared with English speaking background students, non-English speaking background students are 16 percentage points more likely to choose a high-paying discipline, while 4 percentage points less likely to choose a low-paying discipline. The evidence seems slightly stronger for younger Australians, but we found a little statistical evidence that the other 4 measures of childhood disadvantages are linked to the choice of academic disciplines in university. So that's the results for the second research question. Then let's have a look at the results for the last research question. We would like to examine how the choice of academic discipline contributes to the employment profiles of Australians from different disadvantaged backgrounds. We look at 4 labor market outcomes, whether in full-time employment, whether in permanent employment, whether having a managerial or professional occupation, and weekly gross earnings. In table 7, the dependent variable is the dominant variable showing that is equal is the dependent variable is the dominant variable that is equal to 1 if the person is in full-time employment, and it is equal to 0 if the person is not in full-time employment. And we have run 2 sets of regressions. And in the first regression, show in column 1, we don't control for field of study. And in column 2, we show the results when we control for the impact of fields of study. And here, the fields of study are the detailed fields of study, the 15 different categories. And column 1 tells us what we can observe in the labor market. And column 2 tells us when we control for the fields of study, so when the choice of academic disciplines is the same for students from disadvantaged backgrounds and non-disadvantaged backgrounds, what would happen in that hypothetical situation. And in column 1, when we look at all these results, none of them are statistically significant. And so we confirm some of the findings from the previous literature that the employment profiles are comparable across disadvantaged Australians and non-disadvantaged Australians. But in column 2, in the hypothetical case that the disadvantaged Australians and non-disadvantaged Australians have chosen the same fields of study, then non-English speaking background has a coefficient that is equal to minus 0.043. It tells us if non-English speaking background students and the English speaking background students have chosen the same field of study, then the non-English speaking background student would have 4.3 percentage points lower, 4.3 lower percentage points in terms of full-time employment. However, because they have made their free choice, the coefficient is reduced to 2.7 percentage points. So this has told us that because non-English speaking background students have made the choice, and the choice has benefited them, which has helped to narrow their gap in terms of full-time employment. Otherwise, if they have chosen the same field of study, then the full-time employment rate would be 4.3 percentage points lower. Table 8 shows the result for permanent employment, and we have similar findings. So for ACSI, non-English speaking background, fathers unemployment experience, single-parent families, we don't have any significant results here. It means that the results are similar for disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged Australians. And we have a significant coefficient for low childhood socioeconomic status. It shows that they are more likely to have a permanent job. And in column 2, when we control for the field of study, the non-English speaking background has a coefficient of minus 0.0551. It means if students from non-English speaking background and English speaking background have chosen the same field of study, then the non-English speaking background student have a 5.1 lower percentage points in terms of permanent employment. But now, when we don't control for the field of study, it is only minus 0.038. So it has helped to reduce the disadvantage associated with the non-English speaking background. For no childhood socioeconomic status, the coefficients are very similar, and I don't think these two coefficients are statistically different from each other. So it tells us a similar story. Students from non-English speaking background have made the wise choice, and this choice has helped them to reduce their disadvantage in employment in the labor market. In table 9, we show the results for having a managerial and a professional job. For ACSI, fathers unemployment experience, single parent family, we don't have any significant results. This means the results are comparable for those disadvantaged Australians and non-disadvantaged Australians, measured by the 3 childhood disadvantages. However, when we look at the non-English speaking background, the coefficient is minus 0.128. That's highly significant. And the coefficient is minus 0.038 for no childhood socioeconomic status. It tells us that Australians with no childhood socioeconomic status are much less likely to have a managerial or professional job. And those who come from long-English speaking background are also much considerably less likely to have a managerial and professional job. But when we look at the results in column 2, if they have chosen the same fields as their counterparts, then the coefficient have increased to minus 0.143. So it tells us that their choice of academic disciplines has helped reduce their disadvantages in the labor market. But for low childhood socioeconomic status, whether controlling 4 fields of study does not matter for their coefficient. Table 10 shows the results for wages and salaries. The dependent variable is the logarithmic weekly wages and salaries. And again, we found no significant results for ATSI, father's unemployment experience, and the single parent family. And the most significant estimates are found for long English speaking background. Column 1 shows that when we, in the labor market, long English speaking background Australians earn less salary or less income than those from English speaking background, and the gap is about 20%. However, if those from long English speaking backgrounds and from English speaking background have chosen the same field of study as shown in column 2, then the wage gap would have been 26%. So the choice of academic disciplines has helped individuals from long English speaking backgrounds to reduce their labor market disadvantages. So with the same distribution of academic disciplines, their wages would have been 26% lower, but actually in the labor market it's only 20% lower. And whether we control for field of study does not matter for the coefficients for ATSI, no childhood socioeconomic status, and the father's unemployment experience. The results do not change much from column 1 to column 2. Here is the summary of our main results. The choice of academic disciplines among long English speaking graduates has helped improve their labor market performance. Initially we expected that the students from long English speaking background or other disadvantaged background are more likely to be sorted into no paying field of study. But the data shows the reversal story. So they are actually more likely to choose a high paying field of study, which helped them to reduce the disadvantage in the labor market. These people have slightly higher likelihood of full-time employment, permanent employment, and have a managerial professional occupation. And the average age of Australians from long English speaking backgrounds is 20% lower than that of English speaking Australians. And the gap would have been 26% if they have chosen the same field of study. So this finding is consistent with the result found for our research question 2, that the long English speaking Australians are more likely to choose a high paying field of study, but less likely to choose a low paying field of study. And in contrast, the choice of field of study matters little for the employment outcomes of Australians from the other 4 disadvantaged backgrounds. So here is a summary. Here is a summary of our main findings. The first we have shown the patterns of choice of academic disciplines in Australia, and we know that the choice of academic disciplines is linked to different labor market. That's part of our finding in the first research question. And for the second research question, we have shown that the long English speaking background is most strongly associated with the choice of field of study, and the estimates are considerably smaller and statistically insignificant for the other 4 childhood disadvantages we have considered. And in terms of the third research question, we found that the choice of academic disciplines among long English speaking graduates has helped reducing their disadvantage and is associated with better labor market prospects. As such, the real disadvantages faced by long English speaking workers are disguised by the raw wage gaps observed in the labor market. So when we look at the raw data, this gap has underestimated the real disadvantages faced by long English speaking Australians. And we don't find much evidence that we don't find much evidence for Australian from the other four disadvantaged backgrounds. That's the main findings of this paper. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Rong. That was fantastic and really interesting. I can see that the questions have started coming in through the Q&A. So I encourage anyone who has questions to enter your questions into the Q&A or put up your hand if you want to ask your question verbally instead. I'm going to exercise my chair's prerogative and actually ask the first question. And I think it's a similar question to one of the questions that's already in the Q&A. I was wondering, could the sorting or the choice of discipline actually reflect educational disadvantage in the high school sector? For example, not everyone, especially those in rural and remote areas or those in lower socioeconomic status areas, actually have less subject choice when they're at high school, and that could actually impede their ability to get into certain disciplines at university.
Yeah, this is true. For many people, the academic, it's not necessarily a choice for them because they may not have the option. But we have used the term of academic the discipline choice to show the discipline that they have studied in university. But I agree that it's possible that it's not a choice for everybody, and they may face some restrictions when choosing the disciplines.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Rong. I'm going to ask the first question that's in the Q&A. So this is sort of starting in a similar position as me. The terminology discipline choice implies that everyone has the same choices available to them when enrolling at university, which isn't true, and you've responded to that. Given the clearly different discipline enrollments made by people from non-English speaking backgrounds and their outcomes, is non-English speaking background status a good indicator of childhood disadvantage, if at all?
First, we have used the multiple measures of childhood disadvantage because we know that not a single measure can provide a comprehensive measure of the disadvantages they mentioned. That's why we have used the 5 different measures of childhood disadvantages. And in terms of non-English speaking background, I think to some extent it measures the disadvantage, but it's not a comprehensive measure. Regarding the question about how many non-English speaking participants will also lose their socioeconomic status in the data, I don't have a solution. I don't have an answer now, but it's very easy to find the answer in the data. I just need to tab 2 variables. Then
Great.
I know the
Thanks,
answer.
Rong. And I guess sort of building on that question, have you considered looking at analyzers of intersectionality in your analysis? Looking at people who belong to multiple equity groups?
Yeah, that's a very good suggestion, and we can look at it. We have 5 dummy variables, and we can check, how many have all the 5 dummy variables equal to 1, and how many have 3 disadvantages or more. Yeah, we can certainly consider that in our
That's
analysis.
great. Thanks, Rong. The next question. When you discuss socioeconomic status, you mainly look at internal factors relating to the family. I wonder what effect do external factors have, such as living in neighborhoods with lower SES. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, the main thing is that in HEODA data, we have the postcode, and in principle, we can control for the postcode fixed effects. But the postcodes are for their current place of residence, and the people may have moved from one place to another. So it's really difficult to control for the external factors when they were young. So in the analysis, we have controlled for the state of residence, but we haven't controlled for the the neighborhood effects because we don't have this type of measures in the data. Or we have
Is
to
it
make
possible for you to look back in the earlier waves if they've also responded to the earlier waves in HEODA?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, but we need to look at, because most of the measures are about those who are aged 14.
Right.
Whether the father has experienced unemployment and whether they were raised in a single parent family. So even if we have 20 waves of data, this means we cannot identify it for most of the people.
I see.
In the data. We have their neighborhood information for the current place of residence, but we don't have the information for the place they were living when they were quite young.
Yeah.
It's the main problem. And we have tried to control for some, impact by using the state of residence dummies. Yeah, but that's a very sensible point.
Great. Thanks, Rong. I think there's a point by Gina, and I'm trying to see if this is a question. Okay, I think we might come back to that because I think this is more of a comment than a question. We have a question from Nadine. Is the Hilda sample representative of the Australian population? Bracket, it doesn't seem so. And how did you define NESB?
Yeah, Hilda data, I think Hilda data is the only nationally representative panel data for the Australian population. And I think this is a commonly held belief. And regarding the definition of long-English speaking background, we have followed the literature. We define a person to be from long-English speaking background when the first language is not, if the first language is not English. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Rong. Another question is, I wonder if your findings for people of non-English speaking background hold if you remove the country of birth dummy in the model that you use in research question 3.
Yeah, actually, we haven't controlled for the country of birth dummy. We only controlled for the year of birth dummy in the analysis.
Great.
But this leads me to think whether if we control for the country of birth dummy, whether the results would change. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We can certainly look at that.
Thanks, Rong. If there are any other questions, please type that in. We've got a couple of minutes left. Otherwise, I'll ask another question as well. So you've looked at a comprehensive set of employment outcomes. Did you consider looking at job satisfaction, given that, I think that's a pretty important outcome as well. And sometimes people are trading off monetary rewards against jobs that actually pay lower, but actually gives them a greater sense of purpose and satisfaction.
Yeah, that's a very good suggestion. We can certainly look at that. And the measure of job satisfaction is available in every web of Hilda. We can certainly do that.
Great. Thank
But
you.
we haven't do it because we focused on the labor market outcomes, the employment outcomes and the income. We haven't looked at the measures of subject well-being, but we can do it, certainly do it as an extension to the current analysis.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rong.
Yeah.
One more question. It would be interesting to see how rurality changes these outcomes. So I guess that's a suggestion for looking at rurality or rural and remote areas as well.
Yeah, we can do it. We have in our analysis, we have a dominant variable for whether living in a major Australian city. Actually, we have more detailed classification of areas. We can certainly do that type of analysis and see whether the results are different for those living in rural areas and those living in urban areas. Yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
Great. One more question is whether you have a link for the working paper. And I can answer that. This is due to be completed in February, and from February onwards, the outputs from our small grants will be published by ACSES in the form of an ACSES report. So this should be made available next year. And that actually brings me to the next point. So first of all, thank you very much, Rong, for making time to give this wonderful seminar. I think we all learned a lot, and this is quite exciting work. So thank you very much for making time. We do have a series of other webinars that's planned to disseminate the findings from our other grants and fellowships in due course. So if any of you haven't subscribed to our newsletter on ACSES, please do. That's where we will disseminate news of upcoming events as we plan them. So yep, that's it from me for today. And thank you very much to everyone for making time to attend the webinar as well, and have a good day.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you.